welcome back to the Land and Climate Podcast. My name is Alasdair and I've been catching up again with Arctic expert, political geographer and co-author of Unfrozen, Mia Bennett, to talk about Greenland and to explore if there really is anything substantial behind Donald Trump's thirst for the country, and to get a backstory on Greenland's historic relationship with the United States, and also how it has been impacted by climate change.
What Trump is honestly really after is simply an expansion of American territory in a way that would make him an historic president.
You may have listened to a previous interview I had with Mia before Christmas, where she gave an overview of the future of the Arctic. So this time I began our fresh conversation by asking her to sketch a picture of the country of Greenland.
Greenland is, as many will know, the world's largest island. Maybe people think it's even larger than it actually is due to the Mercator projection maps, which show Greenland to be the same size as Africa. Greenland's not quite that big. It's about 1/13 the size of Africa. About 80% of it is completely covered by the Greenland ice sheet. So this ice sheet has existed for millions of years. Most of the island's 57,000 inhabitants live along the western coast of Greenland, which is not covered by ice. The western coast of Greenland is a little bit warmer and more temperate than the eastern coast, which is also more locked in by sea ice for a longer portion of the year. So in short, the capital, Nuuk, and many of the other settlements, you would find all of those on the west coast. Greenland's settlements are not connected by road, so they're all isolated from one another. There's no national road network. So Greenlanders, if they want to go between their settlements, they either fly or take their boats. So many Greenlanders have boats. The Inuit, the indigenous inhabitants of Greenland, who are about 87-90% of the country, have long had very close connections to the sea and the ice. Greenland is a very cold country, becoming warmer in recent years. So in the south, you do have some activities such as a little bit of potato farming, shepherding. Many Greenlanders are still subsistence-based, especially farther up in the north, where you would not be able to grow potatoes. A lot of people still rely on hunting, fishing, sealing activities of that nature. Fishing, in fact, shrimping, those are the largest mainstays of Greenland's economy. Definitely a seafood export-oriented economy.
And you've written about this, which is that actually tourism is one of the new growing parts of the Greenlandic economy, causing some tensions around that growth.
So Greenland in the past several decades even has started to pursue economic diversification. So if we look at the longer history of Greenland, which was colonized by Denmark in the 1700s, starting in, let's say, the 1950s, when Greenland became a country within the Danish kingdom rather than a colony, so the process of decolonization began. At the same time, Denmark was trying to really industrialize a lot of Greenland's economic sectors. So fishing shifted from being subsistence-oriented to export-oriented. So over time, the Greenlandic economy then develops this very large export-oriented fishing economy. But I think there's a big sense nowadays that this is not diverse enough. So the government of Greenland has been pursuing a greater globalization of its economy, largely by attracting tourists. And the idea is to attract big spending eco-tourists, let's say, so not mass tourism, but people who will come for a week-long, several $1,000s, let's say, dog sledding kind of expedition. But to be able to attract that kind of tourists, Greenland has been renovating its airports to make them more easily connected into a global aviation network. So the country's largest airport or largest runway, I should say, is trying to be shifted to Nuuk instead of in Korneliussen. So Korneliussen is a very small settlement where the U.S. military originally had facilities. The military cited those facilities there because of the favorable weather conditions. Now, with Nuuk being by far the largest settlement, the capital of Greenland, aviation networks are going to center there, but the conditions are honestly not very good for aviation. It's always foggy, cloudy, inclement weather. So this has been hampering Greenland's pursuit of really having efficient connections to global airways.
You've also got these cruise ships that sometimes arrive in the capital city and go elsewhere and almost outnumber the population that's already living there.
Greenland has a really rapidly growing number of cruise vessels coming every year. Some of them do go to Nuuk, but I would say the most popular destinations in Greenland for cruise vessels are probably Ilulissat. And Ilulissat is really this stunning UNESCO World Heritage settlement, and it's one along the ice fjord. So Ilulissat in the Greenlandic language, I believe, means icy, basically. And you'll see, if you're just walking along the shore in town, just 100, 200-foot tall icebergs coming off the ice sheet. So it's a really phenomenal sight, and you can see why people from all over the world would want to visit. But indeed, with every passing year, there's more cruise vessels. There's still not the major Carnival or Royal Caribbean cruise ships you'd see elsewhere, but they're bringing in several hundred people at a time. And so Ilulissat has a population of about 5,000 people, but even at that size, the cafes, museums can be quickly overrun. Greenlanders will complain about passengers just taking photos of their children and being disrespectful. So there's certainly, I think, some tensions around cruise ships when they arrive.
And can you see tourism developing and the economies developing? Are we looking at quite a big potential population growth in Greenland, or how do you envisage that working with climate change, for example, and the thawing of the ice sheet?
I think the population is growing. I don't think it's growing exponentially due to either tourism or climate change. Iceland, for instance, their population is growing a lot faster, and a lot of that is due to migration from countries like Poland. Greenland is not really attracting that same kind of within Europe migration, let's say. But I think what's happening in Greenland is more so a centralization of the population to Nuuk, where I believe most of the population, maybe a third of Greenland lives in Nuuk now. And in the 90s, it was much less than that. So people are going to Nuuk for the economic opportunities, be they in tourism, at the expanded airport, in government, things like that. So that's leaving these smaller settlements where Greenlanders have traditionally inhabited really struggling to hang on. So I think you're seeing some of that shift have demographic repercussions in that way.
What is it about Greenland that you think Trump and his US administration actually wants?
Greenland does have an ample stash of rare earth minerals. Many of these are around a site called Kvanfjeld in southeast Greenland. So they are near kind of one of the more inhabitable areas, which does make it a risk to mine potentially because many of these deposits are tied up with uranium. So, okay, there's a potential case for rare earths, which are necessary to support the green transition. American investors could already be participating in the development of Greenland's mineral sector. Over the past few years, there's also been various kind of support and financial aid packages given by the US government to help Greenland develop its mineral and tourism sectors. So there aren't really prohibitions at present preventing the US from supporting and also perhaps even benefiting from Greenland's economic development. So I think what Trump is honestly really after is simply an expansion of American territory in a way that would make him a historic president. The co-author of my book, Unfrozen, Klaus Dodds, refers to what Trump is doing as ego politics, which I think is a kind of pithy way of just capturing how Trump is so driven by real estate deals. He just wants more property, more land. Even if this would come at great expense to the American taxpayer to ultimately fund and provide any level of service to Greenland, which I don't think the administration is thinking through at all. So it's simply just, a real estate acquisition that they're after.
And oil exploration was banned in 2021 by the Greenlandic government. Is there anything that there could be more potential in terms of long-term oil exploration as climate change changes the country?
So I think the ban on oil exploration off Greenland was an easy political win because there was a significant amount of oil exploration offshore in Greenland in the 90s, early 2000s, I believe, and none of that proved fruitful. So for instance, I think UK oil and gas company Cairn Energy poured millions of dollars into trying to find something viable offshore and nothing turned up. So I think even with climate change and things becoming more accessible offshore, it doesn't seem that Greenland has really viable oil and gas deposits. So I would put more money on minerals being developed. But even that is a tricky proposition as well.
The US coveting Greenland for its own expansion isn't actually that new. I've read you say in your blog said that The US has long viewed its neighbour as a giant, icy aircraft carrier / mine flanking the Western Hemisphere rather than as a homeland inhabited by 57,000 people with every right to determine its own destiny. I would quite like to go into that and to maybe talk about that relationship, particularly in terms of how it has used resources in the country, and then in terms of its military science experiments and arguably the mess that it then left.
Maybe if we went back to the 19th century, the US at the time was in this expansionist mindset. So in 1867, the US purchased Alaska from the Russian Empire. And around that time, we have to keep in mind this broader narrative of manifest destiny, this idea that the US was destined to encompass the entire North American continent, all the way from the East Coast up to Alaska, and then potentially even beyond, both across the Pacific to places like the Philippines, which eventually came under American Empire. And then there was equally talk going back across the Atlantic to perhaps purchase Greenland and Iceland. So these discussions were bubbling up around the time of the purchase of Alaska. They didn't really lead anywhere. There was interest, again, on behalf of the US in World War II with regard to purchasing Greenland from Denmark. Denmark was not interested, but because of the events of World War II, where Denmark effectively was unable to defend Greenland from Nazi threat, the US was allowed to establish military bases on the world's largest island. So the US certainly did feel certain vulnerabilities from Greenland being undefended. I wouldn't say these were entirely unjustified either, because I believe there were some Nazi weather stations that were set up around Greenland. And there's always been submarine activity in the North Atlantic. I don't know how close Soviet submarines would have come to Greenland, but certainly there is a sense that Greenland is a little bit vulnerable, undefended. It's a huge island. Denmark's never been able to put up a huge force. So the US comes in, they build military bases, first runways during World War II, and then they establish a permanent base at what used to be called Thule Air Base in 1951 or so. That's now called Pituffik, reverting to the Inuit name Pituffik Space Force Base, because it's now administered by the US Space Force. So this is in the far north of the country, nearly 100 Inuit. So these are northern Inuit who carry out narwhal hunting and whaling. So very northern people. They were forcibly evicted from their homes to make room for this American military base. So incredibly violent overtaking of their lands. Military comes in, they bring in bombers, they put up radar facilities. A lot of this, so now if we're in the 1950s, it's no longer World War II, but the Cold War. So the goal becomes to keep an eye on the Soviet Union from northern Greenland, which is at the halfway point roughly between the US and Soviet Union. So offers a good outpost for monitoring that airspace and also for space surveillance. So looking for intercontinental ballistic missiles that the Soviet Union might potentially launch at North America. So the US has kept Pituffik running since the 1950s. It now has far fewer staff than it did at the height of the Cold War. I think only about maybe 200 people work there. A lot of it is more automated too, with the space surveillance and tracking of objects. It's also facing threats from permafrost thaw and things of that nature. But certainly we have a permanent US military presence in Greenland. We also brought up the issue of the American scientific experiments in Greenland. And there's a whole history there that is also very dark. I think the best example is Camp Century, which was a little bit farther north of where Pituffik Space Force Base is. But effectively, this was in the 1960s. The US thought it would be a great idea to see if they could basically create a military facility under the ice that would be nuclear powered. It would have everything from barracks under the ice to a small chapel and a library. And then eventually maybe they could even store missiles under the ice that would be pointed at the Soviet Union, but which could not be monitored by satellites, which were starting to be developed at the time because they would be hidden. Of course, this was a disastrous idea. The ice melted both from just the heat of human bodies in it to the weight of vehicles driving in these tunnels that were dug into the ice. So it was an incredible engineering project on paper, but also incredibly hubristic one. And it eventually failed. The US left radioactive toxic waste in the ice sheet, and it is still buried there. Fortunately, it used to snow a lot in Greenland. It still does snow a lot. But so a lot of this waste has been buried under meters and meters of snow. There have been concerns over the years that with climate change and accelerating ice loss, some of this radiation could be exposed. From what I've read, it doesn't seem that the threat is that imminent, at least, let's say, in the next 100 years or so. But certainly there's still radioactive pollution in the Greenland ice sheet left by the US military. So there's massive ecological repercussions from American military presence in Greenland.
And has there been any effort from the US government to clean up?
I think they just decided to leave it as it is. I mean, they did try to remove some of the military equipment, but I don't think there was much care given to the radioactive waste. If we put ourselves in the shoes of planners back in the 60s and 70s, the ice was seen as something that was so permanent that maybe they just supposed it could lock things in forever.
Some journalists in the past couple of weeks have been asking the question that if it weren't for climate change, would the US actually be interested in Greenland right now? I think from what you've said is that given that the interests that the US has, which are actually much more about territory, that the climate might not have much impact. But I'd still be interested to know more.
As the purchase of Alaska in 1867 goes, the US has long had a dream of territorial expansion that it has successfully pursued in many ways, whether through colonization or territorial purchases. Climate change, I think, may be the difference that it makes, perhaps. It creates this narrative that the Arctic Ocean is opening, which is a true narrative. The Arctic Ocean is becoming more accessible. But that's something that Donald Trump, despite however much he denies climate change, can at the same time leverage to suggest Russian and Chinese vessels are starting to swarm Greenland. So in a way, it gives him a little bit of ammunition to say Greenland is actually more vulnerable to threats from America's adversaries because it's more accessible. Greenland, as we were saying, it covered 80% by ice. If all of it were to melt, sea level would rise by about 7 meters. So we can just imagine on a global scale how thick that ice is and how much it would upset the balance of things. At current rates, though, the Greenland ice sheet is melting rapidly. It's melting about 6 times faster than it was in the 1980s. And since about 2000, that ice loss has not been replaced by annual snowfall. So the Greenland ice sheet is shrinking and thinning, and it's mostly coming off in the form of meltwater going into the surrounding seas. So right now, that means that Greenland and also Antarctica, they're the 2 largest contributors to global sea level rise. Greenland's ice sheet melting is also potentially destabilizing ocean circulation, making the ocean less salty. So there's various changes happening around Greenland as well that are not only tied to sea level rise, but also reconfiguring climate in other ways. So for instance, if basically the Gulf Stream were to shut down partly as a result of Greenland's ice sheet melting, that could have knock-on effects for rainfall in the Amazon. It could cool European climate with impacts for agriculture. So we can see a lot of northern hemisphere, western hemisphere changes resulting from Greenland ice sheet melt as well. So all of it is a little bit of a dire picture. Maybe one other shift worth mentioning is that as Greenland overall is warming, there's the potential for Greenland's own economy to shift from a more maritime focused one to having at least more terrestrial activities, not only in the form of mining, but also in the form of agriculture. So there are more and more potato farming, also strawberry farming, more shepherding and sheep farming is taking place. None of this would be for the first time. So if we look back on history, the early Norse colonists who came to Greenland, even before the Inuits' ancestors in around the year 1000, they also practiced shepherding, and the climate was a bit different then. So it's interesting to look back in Greenland's climatic history to see how global and regional climate change have influenced the type of activities that are carried out and the lives people are able to live. So in Greenland, the ice sheet is shrinking, but also offshore, you have less and less sea ice. So if we went back to the 1970s, the sea ice was really thick. It was frozen year-round, and year in and year out. And for ice fishermen, they would have to dig a staircase into the ice to be able to get down to a point where they could easily dig a hole to reach the water beneath. Now you don't need to dig a staircase. You can simply go out onto a much thinner sea ice, which makes it, sure, maybe easier to reach the water for ice fishing, but it's so much more precarious. We have more accidents happening with ice breaking beneath dog mushers, beneath skidoos, and things like that. So it's certainly becoming more precarious for people whose lives are intimately bound up with the ice.
You've also emphasized that even were climate change to miraculously stop, there's no going back on the Greenland ice sheet anyway, and its size could not be grown again.
There's talk of geoengineering, and I think that's gaining increasing purchase in global circles as it becomes increasingly clear that the world is not going to reduce its fossil fuel emissions to any meaningful extent in the near future. So geoengineering becomes seen as a potential solution. There's some ideas which are still quite fantastical and controversial of, let's say, putting curtains around the Greenland ice sheet where the glaciers are what's called marine terminating. So many of Greenland's glaciers, they run off into the sea. As the ocean is warming, when they meet the ice, it accelerates their warming even more, or they're melting even more. So this is problematic. So maybe if we put a curtain, it could prevent the warming ocean from touching these icy tongues of glaciers. I don't know how feasible this really would be. It's an idea that's out there to limit the rate of acceleration for ice melt. But effectively, yes, we're not able to really restore the Greenland ice sheet in any meaningful way. So I think the only solution that's even being bandied about is to slow down its loss. But it really, I think, is quite calamitous and makes the Greenland ice sheet's loss different from the Arctic Ocean sea ice and the threats that it faces, because the Arctic Ocean has a built-in repair mechanism because it can refreeze every winter. The Greenland ice sheet needs literal snowfall on it to build itself back up, and that's a much harder thing to bring about.
In the previous podcast, you talked about the increased militarization of the Arctic, and that actually one of the things you say is that it really is distracting from a kind of collaborative Arctic, which would actually be focusing much more on its environment and on its climate. In what ways were we to reverse this militarization, if that were possible? Would we be focusing more on climate, and how could we be doing that?
I do think the 1990s and 2000s, this interlude between the end of the Cold War and the present era where we have increased geopolitical competition, once again, offers some lessons for how countries came together in the Arctic to work on issues such as climate change. In the absence of a Russian threat to European and North American countries, or vice versa, when Russia felt that it was willing to be a little bit more open, countries were able to work on softer issues such as climate, indigenous health, monitoring Arctic wildlife. When military threats rear their heads again, countries simply do not have the appetite to work on these so-called softer issues. So the consequence of that is not only that people aren't talking about climate change, but we've even reached a point where Russia basically is not accessible for scientists from Western countries. So that will have knock-on effects for the extensiveness and accuracy of observing networks for everything from permafrost to terrestrial carbon stores. I think even more acutely, the problem of radioactive waste, which was left behind by the Soviet Union, both on its own territory and offshore in its littoral seas from various submarines, nuclear fuel rods. There had been in the 90s and 2000s a lot of regional international collaboration to try and clean up this problem. But now Russia does not have really an interest in inviting international collaborators to address this issue. So this is another environmental problem that is not necessarily climate related, but it's something that's going to suffer because countries no longer are working together on cross-border environmental issues in the Arctic.
Thanks very much to Mia Bennett for her time. And if you're interested in reading more about Greenland, Mia Bennett has provided links to reading for listeners that you can find in our podcast blurb. And there is also a link to her newly published book, Unfrozen: The Fight for the Future of the Arctic. If you enjoy the show, please do give us a rating if you can, and also do try to follow the show if you haven't already. Doing all this makes it easier for others to find us. Check out the Land and Climate website for fresh writing and new investigations, and we'll be back again in a few weeks' time with another interview. My name's Alasdair McEwen, and thanks for listening.